commercial zones, industrial zones, hazardous substances and contaminated land. We will do a brief introduction of the panel. I'm Lindsay Dacia, I'm chairing the panel. And to my left is
Matt Muspratt.
And to my right,
David McMahon.
I'm Jason Jones.
Thank you. We've got probably a reasonably busy day, but what we need to do first is to have an introductory karakia. Tuia te mane aki aki, rarangi te mana rangatira, kia tipu, kia puawai, I ripo nawai, o te awa kairangi, he kaitiaki, ki te whenua, he oranga, taio, he oranga, tangata, haumai e, hui e taki e. Kia ora, thank you for that. Before we commence, is there anything that we as a hearing panel need to be aware of over and above the material which has already been circulated?
Just a couple of housekeeping things, I guess. I'm Stephen Davis, a reporting officer for Commercial and Industrial. Hamish Wesney is reporting officer for hazardous substances and contaminated land. He's online. He is appearing remotely from the UK, so it's 10:30 for him. So when we do get into the read through, I would recommend doing his topic first, as you'll get him earliest in the evening. Here we've got Peter McDonald for the Council and Miriam Moore, who's the author of the Urban Design Advice in the Commercial 42A. She'll be available for questions. And I just wanted to cover as well, Hamish and Miriam are both work for Boffa Miskell on contract for the Council. Boffa Miskell is also representing a submitter in this stream, Transpower, but my understanding is they're only appearing in the stream for one definition, which is in the industrial topic, and Hamish and Miriam won't be commenting or getting involved in that one, so I think that should address that issue.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. Yes, we're aware, Mr. Wesney, that you are in the UK and it's 10:30 at night, so you're looking quite good for that time of night, actually, I have to say. But we will commence with you first. I have to say we have in total about 500 pages of officers' reports, and we've only got a fairly short time for the rest of the morning to potentially look at some of the higher level issues, but there might be some other matters which will require a response on, and we'll probably end up having to do that at the end of the submitters tomorrow. We'll just see how we go this morning in terms of getting through quite a lot of issues that we do have. The other thing I'll signal, and probably for you, for the officers as well, is that we've done some preliminary thinking, and there is an invitation from a number of parties or a request from a number of parties to be involved in expert conferencing. We're minded that that should occur, and that should occur reasonably speedily, but we'll talk about the process and procedures and the scoping of that probably tomorrow when we finish. Okay. But Mr. Wesney, starting with you first, are you going to give us an overall presentation or highlights, or how did you propose that you'd commence, or should we just go straight to your report and to the into your rebuttal statement?
Yes, I haven't prepared anything by way of an introduction. I'm happy to take my report and rebuttal evidence as read, and happy to answer questions.
Okay, thank you. Should we go straight to questions? Okay. Perhaps starting with Commissioner Jones on my right.
Good morning, Mr. Wesney, and welcome from wherever in the world you are.
Morning.
As the chair said, we're anticipating conferencing, and we have a bit of a mountain to get through today. So I really just wanted to ask a few preliminary questions of you, probably starting with a relatively easy one for starters. And it's just about a drafting issue, I think possibly with one of the policies in the hazardous substances chapter, where you've made a change. I think it is policy 3. I'm just trying to scroll through my notes to find it. I think with the syntax change that you've adopted by adding the word to in the chapeau or by in the chapeau, and then adding ing to clause 1, you haven't carried that same drafting convention down to clause 2. So it's just a very, very minor one.
Yes, I'll make a note of that.
Thank you. And then I want to just ask you as well if we could go to your rebuttal. At paragraph 3.9.
Yes, I'm there.
In the beginning of that clause, you say, as a map spatial tool, the HSRMO must apply a single risk threshold. It seems to me that in reading all the evidence from both the technical experts on this and the planning experts on this, there's obviously different levels of risk that are ascribed to different activities under this suite of provisions. And at least one of the issues that's been flagged is whether a single overlay is fit for purpose for all of those activities. I'm just wondering if you've turned your mind to a multi-tiered approach where there might be using an airport noise arrangement as a bit of an analog, whether there might be an internal boundary and an external boundary, and there might be variable controls applied within those.
Yep. So short answer is no. I haven't considered that type of tiered approach. Two immediate thoughts come to mind. One is the spatial extent of the options of the different risk thresholds. It's not significantly great in my view. And I think the maps attached to Ms. McPherson's evidence highlight the difference we're talking about. And I think the Seaview Marina area is probably the main location where that difference is compared to the other terminals, which are further to the north. And then secondly, I think in terms of the differentiation of the provisions you would have between the different risk contours, and this is based on the HIPAP
Yes.
guidance from New South Wales, that you'd be managing different types of land uses between those two different tiers. And I think that, to me, the difference in the lower hut context isn't that significantly different that justifies having a graduated or a tiered approach. I think it would introduce probably more complexity to the provisions than is justified for the nature of the activities. I think a single contour or line is more efficient than having a tiered approach.
Thank you. That's helpful. And so I guess to that end, I think it's Mr. Van der Munkhoff who's said when there is a uniform arrangement like that, you potentially, and I'm not saying that you believe this to be the case for any activity, but you potentially could end up in a scenario where some activities that may not be as sensitive to the risk would be caught by, say, a broader application of the spatial control, and vice versa. If you're too lenient, then you might allow sensitive activities when you might otherwise not. Do you think his evidence is fair? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. No. That's the issue as I understand it too.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. The only other preliminary question I wanted to ask you about was the legal submissions that we received recently from the fuel companies. Have you had an opportunity to read those?
Yes, actually I should have added at the start that I've read Mr. Enright's legal submissions. I've also read Ms. Pollich's rebuttal evidence from the 18th of May, and also the hearing statement from Mr. Lygard from CV Marina and Ms. Blackwell's rebuttal evidence as well. So I've read those my 4 documents since my rebuttal was prepared.
And well, maybe as a precursor question, then has anything that came out of any of those additional materials altered or modified your position on any points that we should be aware of?
No. No, to me, it just clarified probably a few of the points I'd read in there, evidence in chief, and Mr. Enright's legal submissions, I think, just emphasised some other points I'd already considered, such as the NPS for infrastructure.
Yeah, that was what I wanted to ask you about. So I'm going to be asking some questions of Mr. Enright tomorrow about this, but I'm keen to understand your view. So I'm looking at the bottom of page 12 of his submissions and the top of page 13. Let me know when you're there.
Yep.
We'll just take a moment and let the rest of the panel catch up as well.
Yes, no, I'm there.
Great. I'll just foreshadow while my colleagues are catching up. What I'm particularly interested in here is how we as a panel should apply policies 8, 9, and 10, how we should read those. And Mr. Enright has emphasized the language used in policies 8 and 9 around enabling infrastructure. And then he's drawn a parallel to it along with the language that's used in policy 10. And he seems to be inviting us to potentially read that policy 10 is a subset of achieving policies 8 and 9. When you get down to paragraph 60, I think, of his submissions, he says, regionally significant infrastructure must be enabled, including by management of incompatible activities and by ensuring that existing infrastructure and minor or major upgrades of the fuel terminals are not compromised by neighboring activities. So what I'm ultimately interested in from you, Mr. Wesney, is that enabling direction under policy 8. Is it separate to, in your view, the direction under policy 10, or is there a relationship between the two where one depends on the other in some way?
Yeah, when I read that the legal submissions, I kept going back to those three policies, policy 8, 9, and 10, and was reading them in their whole.
Yes.
I think Mr. Enright's highlighted particular words or phrases in the individual policies, but I think when you read them in their whole, that's a slightly different context from some of the emphasis he's made.
Yeah.
So in terms of your question around is policy 10 enabling, supportive of the enabling direction in policy 8?
Mm-hmm.
In part, I would say, because it's requiring decision makers to manage the incompatibility issue.
Yes.
So it's by managing that you are enabling the infrastructure probably indirectly.
Yes.
But I wouldn't say it's there's a direct link between policy 8 and policy 10 from an enabling perspective.
And enabling, I guess, can have a much broader application for, say, new infrastructure when you're considering something, on the face of it.
Correct.
Okay. And then one last question on that same set of policies. Under subclause 2, under policy 10, decision makers on planning instruments are to engage with infrastructure providers to understand their existing and planned infrastructure activities and medium and long-term plans. Now, we can obviously ask the fuel companies themselves about this tomorrow, but do you have a brief summary of any known planned changes to that infrastructure at Seaview that we should be aware of?
No, not to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you. That's all from me, Mr. Wesney. Thank you very much for all three of your briefs. I think you've made it quite clear what the main points in contention are, so that's been really helpful for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Wesney. Commissioner McMahon here.
Good
Welcome.
morning.
I understand you're in the UK at the moment,
Correct.
and we won't keep you too long. I think I had the benefit of your late night stay at a recent Wairarapa combined hearing meeting. I think we keep you to about 12:30 New Zealand time on that, so hopefully it's not as bad this time. Look,
Well,
I just
I'm here as long as you need me.
I just wanted to follow up on a couple of matters. The two questions I had, Mr. Jones has largely covered, but just for the record, can I just take you to pages 3 and 4 of the legal submissions from Mr. Enright? And
Yes.
in paragraph 15, he indicates that the fuel company's position is that whilst there's a broad measure of support, some material changes are required, as outlined by his planner, Ms. McPherson. And then he lists 5 matters over the page. Can I just get your confirmation that, particularly in relation to the first 4 bullet points, that you haven't changed your position in any way on those 4 matters? That's the residential land use criteria, the pipeline corridor, the definition of reverse sensitivity, and some of the amendments to the marina zone dealing with reverse sensitivity. Yeah,
Correct from the additional evidence I've read, but I just note I haven't commented on any of my evidence on the definition of reverse sensitivity. That's
No,
Mr. Davis.
That's right, yes, and I'll put that question to Mr. Davis later this morning. And I acknowledge you raise a good point. There's a lot of overlap between some of Mr. Davis's reporting and yours in relation to the interface between zones and the hazardous substances provisions.
Yes.
Second question, and this is a question that I'll definitely put to Mr. Enright tomorrow. Yeah, tomorrow. Relates to the MPSI, and Mr. Jones has already touched on that. Clearly, the proposed district plan, and were you an author of the hazardous substances section on the plan?
Yes, I was involved in the preparation of that chapter.
Yes, I mean obviously that was produced well before the MPSI came into force in mid-January this year, and obviously unless there was some sort of soothsaying going on, I guess the council wasn't in a position to know what was in that other than any advanced drafts. And if there is any disconnect, and I say if there is any, that's completely understandable. The legislation says that district plans must give effect to those higher order MPSs, and it has a codicil on that in terms of, well, a couple of the MPSs that were introduced have a time frame, but the MPSI doesn't. It uses the term as soon as practicable, I think, or as soon as possible. And my question really is, do you think that, based on your revised provisions, that the hazardous substances chapter and the interface with that does give effect to the MPS? And obviously, it can only do so in terms of the scope afforded to it by way of submissions. So it's 2 questions there. A big question on whether it does give effect, and secondly, are there any residual matters where it might not because there's not scope to do so, and in which case might there be a need for some further variation or plan change or first schedule process down the line?
It's tricky to answer that because there's so many aspects to the NPS infrastructure. So for example, we can put the blinkers on just for hazardous substances, but from my perspective, one of the aspects is considering spatial planning, and the role of Seaview in Lower Hudson and the wider Wellington region as a heavy industrial area, and with the particular focus with the existing fuel terminals. To me, that particular national policy direction, I think, would get greater weight in the next iteration of a future development strategy or something like that, which didn't exist at the time of the current future development strategy. So I just highlight that one policy as an example that there's probably a range of considerations in this new NPS for infrastructure that would need to be considered overall. So I think I'm not in a position now to say has it given effect to it fully, but in terms of the policies that Mr. Enright's highlighted, being 8, 9 and 10, from my perspective in terms of hazardous substances, I think it does give effect to that. I'd highlight it's probably a very narrow aspect of the NPS for infrastructure in terms of very specific about the fuel terminals. But from my perspective, yes, it's in line with the policy direction that's been introduced.
That's useful. So yeah, it was a big question. I apologise for that. And just for the record, the fuel company's submission would provide the scope to give effect to 8, 9 and 10 in your view?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Just out of interest, Mr. Wesney, was there a draft of the NPSI in circulation prior to the notification of the plan that you were aware of, or
I'd
not?
need to go and check. Yeah, I need to just go check the sequence of events as to the timeframes. But it's nothing's apparent in my mind at this point.
I think unlike some of the other NPSs, which was signalled in terms of IB and HPL, we potentially knew what was going to be in those drafts well before they were gazetted a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. Okay, I'll leave it at that, and I'll take up some of those issues with Mr. Enright tomorrow. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Musgrave.
Morning, good evening, Mr. Wesney. Commissioner Muspratt here.
Morning.
Given that there's going to be expert conferencing, I'm just going to stick to a few questions that I think might not be the focus of that. And I'd like to start with sensitive environments. So if I can, paragraph 57 of your evidence. So when I read the provisions of the chapter, I kind of had the same questions as EnviroNZ did regarding, well, what is a sensitive environment? And you provide a really good explanation there at paragraph 57. I was wondering if you could turn your mind to whether or not you think a definition might be useful for implementing the plan, so plan users have a better idea of what a sensitive environment is.
Possibly, but it's because of the sensitive environments, it's not a commonly used term in the plan. And it's, as I've described in my 42A report, it's to me a sort of, I use it as an all-encompassing term to encapsulate the natural environment aspects, such as I've referred to water bodies, coastal environment, but also other values which may not be always identifiable. So in the Seaview context, Urupa is to me a sensitive environment. So I think there's a danger of trying to, in defining it, that it could unintentionally exclude aspects. So I think from my view, it's preferable to just retain it as a broad reference in the policy to a sensitive environment.
Okay. All right, thank you. Sticking to the topic of sensitive environments, we've got, if we could go to policy HSP1, or I think paragraph 99 of your evidence.
Yes.
Just clause 3, where you're recommending the addition of new. In your view, would that capture extensions to existing hazardous facilities? Would that be new, or is it new as in a completely new?
So just to double check, talking about policy 3, or is it rule?
HSP 1, clause 3.
Sorry, clause 3. Sorry. To me, it would be basically new standalone facilities. It wouldn't be. It wouldn't apply to additions or alterations to or new buildings to existing sites or existing facilities. Sorry.
Okay, so it's the intent that wouldn't apply in terms of the location within sensitive environments for additions to existing hazardous facilities?
Correct.
I think my last question, my last question really is it's more of a, I guess, a suggestion type question in terms of jurisdictions between regional council and territorial authorities in managing contaminated land. In my experience, there does seem to be a bit of a misconception that the regional plan doesn't include any provisions for the management of contaminated land, and everything is under the NES for contaminated soil. I'm just wondering if there was scope. For example, the NRP manages detailed site investigations and discharges from contaminated land. Whether there's scope or an opportunity to introduce some wording in the introduction, so plan users are aware of that.
I'd need to go back and check the fuel company's submission. I think that's the only one that would potentially provide that scope in terms of their submission on the introductory text.
Okay, thank you. That's all my questions.
Commissioner Jones, you've got a follow-up question?
Yeah, sorry for butting back in, Mr. Wesney. Commissioner Musprat's first question to you just pinged something in my memory, and I wanted to make sure that I had your view correctly summarized in my mind. I think it was in your errata report you further addressed the issue of the sensitive environments. And if memory serves, one of the reasons you also cautioned us against using a definition was your concern about plan stop, and that you'd identified that at least some of the things that might reasonably be included in a definition for sensitive environments are necessarily outside the scope of what we can deal with. Do I remember that correctly?
Yes, that was, I think it was the fuel company's submission where they sought that, the definition refer to those overlays which have been withdrawn. So that and no alternative definition has been suggested apart from
Yes.
question from Mr. Musprat just now.
Yes. But your view remains that we'll be limited, at least if there's a persistence around pursuing the overlays as a proxy for defining sensitive environments, that we should proceed with caution.
Correct, given those overlays no longer exist.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, just a couple from me too, Mr. Wesney. And again, going back to sensitive environments. When I first looked at this, I looked at how broad and encompassing this definition was. Is there any other plans which are using this particular way of specifying various different activities, like activities sensitive to noise? Might not be within your wheelhouse to look at the whole definition of sensitive environments, but if you think about hazardous substances, it's a sort of approach which has been used in other plans to actually, because it's very clear in terms of noise that there are activities which are sensitive to noise, but in relation to hazardous substances, it's other things apart from the human factor. It's potentially, things which are important in the general environment as well, physical features and so forth. Is this an emerging trend, or is it being used elsewhere?
Not specifically. I'd need to check that, and it probably more reflects the way the policies are framed in the Lower Hutt plan, where compared to other plans which would be more prescriptive and list the particular environments that are sensitive in this context. So you'd have in other plans that come to mind, you'd have a list of 7 or 8 different environments listed in the policy, which would cover what would be the sensitive environments in that particular district or city. So I wouldn't say it's a common or an emerging trend or feature of plans to capture, as another way to capture these types of environments.
Yeah, I'm sure it's going to come up in other hearing streams as well about what's in and what's not in terms of the definition of sensitive environments. But okay, I think we'll leave that one for now. My last one is in relation to your rebuttal statement, your para 363, when you talk about the request from Seaview Marina to introduce a new policy and rule, and you talk about some of the difficulties with that, maybe classified as a consequential amendment, but the proposal introduces a new activity statement, but you're leaving us to determine whether or not it's within scope. What's your view on whether we have scope to deal with this?
To me, this is one of those classic ones it's hard to pinpoint the scope. I think that's because there isn't the nature of the Seaview Marina submission on this particular one. It is all encompassing. So there's, on one hand, and this is where I'll sit on the fence. On one hand, it's a very broad relief that Seaview Marina have sought. So there is a case that you could differentiate the activity status for residential activities, because that's a particular aspect Seaview Marina have highlighted in their submission generally, but it wasn't referenced in the hazardous substances submission point. But equally, because it wasn't specifically requested, it's arguable that it's not within scope. But if based on what I've read, I think there is an argument that you do have scope for this one because of the general nature of the reliefs they sought, and when you read the submission as a whole.
Well, part of the reason for the question is that all the way through this hearing there is potential issues of scope with a number of different things, and we're being advised that to be particularly cautious when it comes to scope. So I was just very interested in your view, rather than us having to potentially determine it, whether or not we could get some evidential advice on whether or not there is a scope issue or not. And I know you were fence sitting, and I appreciate your response, but it is a factor which we will need to look all the way through the plan hearings, actually, in terms of the scope of submissions, because they were lodged a year ago. Lots happened since, including the plan stop and including new national instruments which have been put in place. So yeah, I'm not necessarily expecting a response from you unless you wish to offer it, but we would really like some guidance about whether or not we actually have the ability formally to make these changes.
Okay, understood. I can discuss with Mr. Geard as well how we can respond to that one as well in terms of any other advice that may be needed.
All right. Thank you for that. Any other questions?
Just on that, obviously that scope issue doesn't just relate to the matter that you've raised in 363. We probably need an inventory of all of those issues so that Mr. Geard can perhaps brief Mr. Quinn accordingly. And that'll apply to Mr. Davis too.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll let you go and have a bit of relax before you need to retire for the night, Mr. Wesley. Obviously you have access to the recordings and so forth. So if there is anything happens overnight for you, I'm sure you can be across it too. As signalled, we do think there is benefit in conferencing. So you presume you have some availability. You're not intending to be back in New Zealand next week or anything, are you?
No, not for the, but no, that's, I'm certainly have availability to attend conferencing remotely.
All right. Okay. Thank you for that. Right.
I'll see you all tomorrow.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Wesley. Now, Mr. Davis, have you thought about how you want to approach your 42A reports and your rebuttals? Because they're quite extensive documents. Whether you wanted to give us an explanation of and sort of an overview, or do you just want to go straight to questions? Because if we talk about commercial zones in particular, I would like to know spatially what's different from the operative plan, what's new and what's not. And it's not entirely clear through your reports where there has been a change from the operative to the proposed. That sort of thing would be helpful. Or else we could just do a page, do a page turn as we did with the initial report. But I wondered how you thought you might want to tackle this, particularly when we have Ms. Moore in here in the room as well.
Yes, I wasn't planning to do like a presentation or a sort of summary of issues in contention, because there are quite a lot of issues in contention still, as you see from the evidence lodged, both covered in the rebuttal and it's come in since the rebuttal. I know Miriam's had the chance to read the evidence that has come in before the rebuttal. I haven't checked in with her since then, so I don't know. So I don't think we've got anything to open there, and it would probably be best to leap into questions. Obviously, where they're big, there's two main reports and then errata and then rebuttal.
Okay.
Mr. Davis, I would certainly appreciate a very brief overview along the lines that the chair indicated. These zones are many, and the relationship between them and the relationship back to the operative plan is quite important context. I'm conscious of time. I don't want you to do that at the expense of answering questions, but the spatial extent of those zones, an overview of the policy approach or flavour of the zones, and just a key summary of some of the key rules and techniques. I mean, I've listed some that I'm not aware of or not have questions about concerning GFAs, active frontages, the relationship between active frontages and car parking standards, and the servicing rule, which I've not come across before. So, but we can deal with those latter matters through questioning, but some sort of understanding of the spatial extent of the zones and the policy approach between them would be useful, may actually negate the need for a lot of questions.
Sure. So,
and you could follow that up and you'll write a reply with something more formal, but just giving us a flavour of that in the next 5 or 10 minutes, I think would be useful.
Sure. Nathan is hard at work on just pulling up the maps for you. I don't have a map that in itself shows sort of the changes from the ODP to the PDP as proposed.
No,
but we can show them side by side, and I can give you a tour of the sort of the zones that we're proposing in the plan, and sort of a high-level description of how they relate to what's
from a narrative point of view is sufficient at this stage.
Yeah, you would. A case in point is mixed-use signs on Cuba Street.
Yep.
Okay. quite different from the operative plan. What is the thinking in behind? What is potentially is enabling a reasonably substantial change in land use?
Sure. Did you want to start with that or sort of go down the
Well, you
tier of
can do
zones?
if it fits in. But obviously you've got the central city zone, which is pretty well defined. Has that been increased? Is there, from the ODP, as a starter, perhaps go in terms of hierarchy?
Sure. So, as you say, the city centre zone is the top of the hierarchy. It is very close in extent to the central commercial activity area in the ODP. It does have a few tweaks around the edges of the zone, particularly right where we're sitting now. We've increased a lot more of the sort of civic precinct in the city centre zone, which has a dedicated precinct. In the ODP, that was a recreation zone, although it is covered by designations. At the northern end, there are also some commercial properties that have been included in the zone that have been commercial for some years. The policy approach is a bit of a shift from what is in the operative plan that itself was a bit of a shift only 3 years ago in our intensification planning instrument. The operative plan before that had a precinct sort of based approach to the city centre with roughly the same rules in each area, but quite different policy direction around considering applications for new buildings. One of the key things there was a difference in height, which was removed through the intensification planning instrument. The proposed district plan somewhat brings back the idea of treating different parts of the city centre differently, which is done chiefly through the Riverbank precinct and the civic precinct, which you can see on the maps there in orange and blue, and especially the active frontage controls A, B, and C, which have both control the design of new buildings and control which land use activities are permitted as of right at ground level. These are certainly both the extent of those and what controls apply are in contention. At a high level, it is quite a liberalisation from the operative plan, which controls these sort of active frontage matters across the entire zone. The PDP approach would leave a lot of sort of minor side streets that are less pedestrianised and don't have a lot of pedestrian activity at the moment. They would have a much lower level of there's still a rule that would trigger for new development, but what gets considered is probably less strict. So that's probably the key things I think for the city centre.
Just before you move off the city centre, Mr Davies, is when you refer to the western edge of Jackson Street and the zone in your reports, what area are you referring to?
That will be in the metropolitan centre zone, which is what I was just about to move
Okay,
to.
thank
So
you. Thank you.
if there's nothing on the city centre, something to do there. So the metropolitan centre zone, I don't know why the internet is lagging like that, I would apologise for those hard to read stripes, but they are the national planning standards, which I will blame for those. So that is that stripy area. It includes, possibly a little hard to see here, areas outlined in a green dashed line, which is the character transition precinct, and I don't think it's visible at this zoom. Oh, it won't be visible at all because it's no longer in this map. But the area sort of along Jackson Street between those two areas of the character transition precinct is the Jackson Street Heritage Area. Same name in the PDP, now withdrawn, and also the same name in the operative plan, which will be carried over as the heritage provisions have been withdrawn, so the operative ones will stay. The boundaries of it were going to slightly change in the PDP, and so I'm recommending some slight tidy ups to the character transition precinct to match what it will have to be, as it'll have to match the operative version. So you can see there that there's a big area, and bigger in both dimensions in the western end there, which is 40 plus years ago was industrial and has transitioned to a mix of, more of a mix of activities, but particularly large format retail. And then the strip along Jackson Street in the east is a more traditional high street type environment and is heritage protected for most of its length. The operative plan sort of splits the zone in two and has some overlapping provisions, but also a lot of different ones for the two different areas. The proposed plan approach would consolidate largely sort of land use provisions, what types of activities are controlled, but still uses those active frontage controls to differentiate the areas and the character transition precinct to control design. The idea of that character transition precinct is to sort of achieve amenity and aesthetic outcomes along there, even though they're areas that are not protected for heritage values. So that would be sort of controls in the look and feel, but not the scale of that development. One thing I think that will be in contention is that the operative plan had a minimum gross floor area for retail and other commercial activities in the western end, with the aim of limiting competition with small scale retail and commercial activities along the heritage part of Jackson Street. That's been removed in the PDP and covered, I think, extensively in the 42A, the rebuttal and the evidence of submitters. Sorry, not in the rebuttal. So that's the metropolitan centre zone. Anything on that before we move on down the?
We'll probably take a little bit lesser time with the local centre zones and the neighbourhood centre zones, but presumably the local centre zones are Wainuiomata, Stokes Valley, Nainai.
Yes, so I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but there are about a dozen local centre zone.
Yeah.
And then 20 or so, I think, neighbourhood centre zones. They are extremely similar in their provisions as proposed, and they were the same zone in the draft plan. The real key difference is just the GFA threshold for triggering consent for land use activities. They do differ in sort of the application of those active frontage controls still. There are both of them use the B and C controls, and the local centre zone also uses the A control.
So the IPI process back in 2023 covered these, we went into this level of detail as well?
The IPI process, these zones were what is in the ODP called the Suburban Mixed Use Activity Area, which is not a helpful name because it is not particularly similar to the mixed use zone under the planning standards or the PDP.
Yeah.
It is very much intended as a sort of local centre zone type zone, but so these two between them largely replace that, which was traversing the IPI in terms of the height of buildings chiefly. The land use provisions weren't really touched. It was a relatively new zone anyway. It had been introduced in Plan Change 43 in 2019. It would have taken legal effect. And so there wasn't a substantial change in the IPI to those. Likewise, I don't think it's a huge change in policy approach for the PDP as well. There's also, I think, probably fewer submissions on the details of the local centre and neighbourhood centre zones.
Okay.
Although there certainly are issues in contention with them.
No, that's fine about those. Can you tell us about the mixed use zone?
Sure. So the mixed use zone is, as per the planning standards and is set out in the definition of commercial centres, not part of the hierarchy in itself. Certainly there's no provisions that try to protect commercial activity in this zone. It's unlike the centre zone that there are no provisions that specifically encourage commercial activity or community activities. It is entirely anticipated, and I would expect going to be fairly common, that the large majority of its sites will be residential. It's used for a bunch of different circumstances that the ODP did different things with or didn't do at all. And so it is, many sizes, one size fits many kind of zone. It replaces a lot of sites in the ODP that had site-specific provisions that were often quite detailed and not thought justified, and so this is a sort of standard zone to replace a number of those. It applies around the edges of some centres where the council has no plans to sort of, extend its street treatments or infrastructure to, make those a more inviting commercial environment, but where we see that as the population grows with intensification, there may be more demand in particular centres, and so it is signalling, probably a relatively weak signal, but signalling where would be appropriate locations for extensions of those centres if and when there's demand for them. And then it's applied along a few corridors, as you mentioned, the Cuba Street and the corridor that we're looking at now. There's also Victoria Street immediately to the north in Alistown, Hutt Road to our west, and then parts of High Street between the city centre and the hospital. The Cuba Street part was signalled in a council strategy, Petone 2040, which was a few years ago now, and a lot of it has been sort of overtaken by national direction. The other areas are not signalled in existing council strategies, but the idea with these is that they are arterial roads that are not necessarily the greatest of residential environments, so there's less of a policy reason to encourage residential there, even though the PDP is not trying to discourage it. They are key public transport routes, so all of the 2-digit numbered buses go along those routes, and they do replace they largely apply along what are mostly existing residential areas that often have existing commercial uses sort of peppered along them, doctors' offices, motels, things that have been provided for in the past in residential zones, but not in the current ODP or previous ones.
So it's a bit of a free-for-all zone, really.
It's applied to a lot of circumstances. I don't think it's a free-for-all. It has, compared to a general commercial zone, it has quite restrictive conditions on activities, particularly that activities that involve visitor car parking trigger a consent, and there is a either 100 square metre or 200 square metre GFA threshold for different types of commercial activities, which is a lot lower than in the centre zones.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we'll move to questions of the 42A report.
Thank you,
for
Mr.
that.
Davis. I really appreciated that.
Just who would like to go first? I think we need to probably do a section turn. Okay. It's a little bit difficult when you've only got it on a screen. So we have the introductory part of it. So commercial, yeah. Okay, and then glossary, abbreviations, procedural issues, integration with operative district plan. Yeah, I just had a question, your para 23, and it's something Ms. Allen from the Tony Historical Society is talking about, is about the relationship between the heritage provisions and the now withdrawn parts of the plan. You're saying the exact area is different, but the policy approach is similar. So it's just a matter of just taking what you have in the ODP and applying that to within the PDP framework when it comes to things to do with heritage. Is that the way you interpret it?
Yes, I mean
You just have a whole bunch of cross-referencing. It can all sort out a hyperlink across to the ODP provisions when it does come to a heritage area or an identified heritage building, as an example.
Yeah, I think it is still hopefully going to be simpler than in the ODP. There are a lot of cross-references in the ODP between the Petone Commercial Activity Area and the Heritage Buildings and Structures chapter, because heritage issues are spread across both chapters. Where I don't think this decision's been made, but I think in the report I'm anticipating that we would do a National Planning Standards update to the ODP when it gets integrated, and so those heritage-related Petone Commercial Activity Area provisions will be moved into the heritage chapter, and so I think there would be much fewer cross-referencing needed than what the ODP provides for. Additional ones can be added, I think, depending on the outcomes of other decisions on.
Yeah,
Natural zone
I guess is it your view that the approach is just a holding pattern until things are clearer in terms of legislative frameworks and what's in and what's out and so forth? Because it's not an ideal situation, but we did express that view at hearing stream 1.
Yeah, I think the key issue the heritage provisions in the PDP, had they not been withdrawn, would have fixed a lot of technical issues in the rules, which are needed. But the overall policy approach is fairly similar, and there are only so many policy approaches you can take in a heritage chapter. The key is the identification of different areas and sites, which would have been a key issue in contention. There were a lot of new listings in the heritage chapter before it was withdrawn. With the Jackson Street Heritage Area, the PDP would have slightly reduced its extent. That can be, I don't think it's urgent to address that. It can be reevaluated whenever there is time, if there is.
All right, thank you for that.
If the plan still does that.
Thanks, Mr. Davis. You've answered my question on 23, which was bigger. In 26, you say, I will make recommendations on how the proposed plan could be altered. You haven't done that, and that I could say you're yet to do that, aren't you?
I've done some in there. That's chiefly just changing the wording of references to which chapters are cross-referenced. I think in more detail, it's probably worth doing that in the wrap-up hearing when more substantive decisions have been made or signalled.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, we'll move on. Statutory and policy context. Cross-topic resource and management issues.
Under the urban design section on paragraph 32, the intention to develop guidance that sits outside of the plan, and this will be something that Ms. Moore will be interested in. That's something that will happen in the future. Is there a time frame for that?
Yes, at this stage, the council's intentions are to wait for decisions on the plan to start preparing that, so it knows what outcomes it's going to need to advise people how to achieve.
Sure, and that would involve some consultation with stakeholders, etc.
I would imagine so. There's no project plan or specific.
Yes. In the meantime, where urban design is a matter of discretion or control or part of a wider discretion enabled as a DA, is it the policy guidance and assessment matters that will prevail in the meantime?
It's intended that those would always prevail. The intended approach of the PDP is that the guidance that sits outside the plan is helpful for applicants and a potential resource for them, but if they want to show how they've achieved those outcomes in other ways, which I guess would probably be getting their own urban design advice and assessment done, they'd be able to do that even after that guidance is issued.
But when you refer to guidance outside the plan, is there some existing guidance in place already ahead of the urban design guidance that's going to be sort of worked on?
There's existing urban design guidance that sits outside the plan for the ODP. Okay. I imagine that will still be at least somewhat useful to applicants if there's a gap before the council can issue new guidance. Yes. There's also the guidance in the operative plan that still sits within the plan.
Sure.
Which will still be at least I mean, the PDP will not become operative in full, I think, until after that new guidance is issued, so it'll still be technically relevant and can be.
Is there a definitive out of the plan guidance document currently? Or is it a series of different instruments?
For the ODP.
Yes.
For the residential zones and the suburban mixed-use zone, there's a single urban design guide for that. It's the plan that was introduced as a in-plan guide, in-plan change 43 in 2017 as proposed, and then through the course of that hearing was removed from the plan, but council kept it and has updated it
Okay.
several times as an outside the plan
Understood.
document.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we'll come on to some standards in relation to urban design matters later on in your report. Right, strategic directions. Mr. Jones.
Good morning, Mr. Davis. Thank you for your reports. I think you sat in on hearing stream 1 when we were asking questions about the strategic directions of Ms. Pascal. And one of the tasks that we ascribed to her was to survey the strategic objectives and to try to identify any that are drafted more in policy terms than as outcome statements. And I think perhaps these two that you refer to here, 012 and 013, might fall within that camp. I was just wondering whether you might, as a drafting exercise to assist the panel, provide us with a drafting solution to recast those as outcome statements, much in the same way Ms. Pascal has with the examples in her report.
Yes, I can do that.
Thank you. And I guess I'll just signal now in a related sense, I think there's submissions that will come to where it might be the Petone Historical Society seems to be seeking policy language to be introduced at the beginning of objectives, kind of contrary to the concept that I'm exploring, and you've recommended that those submissions are rejected. But then by the same token, the 3 urban design policies in each of these commercial chapters seem to be geared towards outcomes, environmental outcomes, which would be more geared towards objectives. So I just wanted to signal to you that that sort of consistency and purpose of objectives and policies is something that's
Sure.
front of mind for me.
Nothing else on strategic objectives. The centre zones, chapter summary, which we've covered in your explanation to some extent anyway. Resource management issues. Your para 56, I've just got it highlighted. And you're referring to the, presumably the Petone Historical Society submissions. And I was just a little bit unsure about what you're trying to achieve in Western Petone. So it really, by limiting floor space, you really just is an absolute protection for the small scale stuff to all go in the Jackson Street heritage area or along that strip as opposed to the western end. Is that my understanding of it?
That would be my understanding of it as well. Obviously, they'll be appearing, so you can ask them that.
Yeah, so, but it's a real enablement of big floor plate within the western end of Petone, which is, a lot of it is there already.
Yes, I think it's common ground between me and the submitters that the western end should enable either permitted or through a resource consent assessment, large scale, large format commercial, which the ODP does and the PDP continues to do. There's a threshold for integrated retail activities over a certain threshold, but it's not discouraging. It's just requiring urban design and some related assessments. The point in contention is whether that western end allows small scale activities.
And just, I don't really want to linger on it too long, but you're saying that para 56, such a provision would only achieve anything if there was demand for such businesses, and the policy would effectively suppress it. What do you actually mean? Why? How would a policy suppress business demand?
The idea, as I understand, again, you can ask the submitters this, but my understanding of their point is that those provisions that would restrict businesses under a certain size in that area would, have the result of stopping some businesses that otherwise might have set up, and that would mean that they would be more likely to locate in Jackson Street instead of in the western end. That would be what that provision was designed to achieve, and how its success would be measured.
Yeah, okay. We'll come on to this a little bit later as well. Should we move on? I just had your paragraph 68, bottom 22. You say at the bottom of that paragraph, to attempt to force visitors to a centre they do not value by restricting one they do, is, I think, fundamentally incompatible with the relevant objectives and policies of the MPS for urban development and the RPS. Can you just explain in layman's terms how they are fundamentally incompatible?
The idea of the NPS and particularly the RPS is to set out a hierarchy of centres where a larger, busier centre with more demand attracts more visitors from across a wider area of the region. If you are restricting development in an area for the sake of this centre's policies, you would intend that the result of that would be that you're trying to encourage people to go to a larger centre instead. I think it's not really compatible with that direction to restrict development in one area to send it to a centre that will be further down the centre's hierarchy. I don't think that's compatible with what that centre's hierarchy is trying to achieve.
So you don't feel that there is... The district plan shouldn't have too much, can only have a limited amount of influence on business location.
It can have a limited, I'd phrase that the other way, I'd agree. It can have an influence on business location, but to the extent it does so, it should be trying to achieve the centre's hierarchy goals, which is encouraging development further up the centre's hierarchy for those sorts of land uses that would be big regional destinations and large areas of demand.
So the higher up the hierarchy, the more sort of flexibility there is?
Yep.
Okay. All right, we're on 5.3. Provisions not in dispute.
Just on those provisions not in dispute, are they deemed to be operative now?
They're not deemed to be operative, they don't have legal effect. It would be up to the resource consent planners to decide
How
whether
much
to give it
weight?
more weight because they're not in dispute.
Okay, understood.
All right, I take it we're at top of page 30, introduction metropolitan centre zones, and the local centre zone, active street frontage standards, invalid and unclear, use of zones, objectives, activities in the zone. Well, I'm at 107. Okay, well, over to you.
Not sure whether we're hearing from Fins. Don't think we are.
They're not appearing.
They may have lodged a statement.
I think they've got a statement, yes, from you.
Yes. Just a couple of general questions about emergency service facilities. I'm aware that when the RMA was enacted, agencies like polytechnics and fire service lost the ability to designate. I understood that ability had been reintroduced through the now withdrawn MBEA. I don't know whether that's been carried over into the RMA in its current format, possibly not. Do you know whether FINS are a requiring authority?
I don't know off the top of my head whether they are eligible to be requiring authority. They don't hold any designations.
No. Okay. What's the activity status for emergency services facilities? In this case, this was the city centre and metropolitan zone that you're dealing with at paragraph 108, 109, 110. What would the default activity status be? What would be the entry activity status for those facilities? I know what FINSA is asking for, but under the PDP?
Give me a second. It does differ between zones, so I'll need to check.
Yeah.
There's no specific rule for it, so it would fall within the catch-all CCZR 17, which would mean it's permitted as long as it complies with standard 7 active frontages land uses,
Okay.
which I imagine it would.
Yes.
The building itself would also fall under the buildings and structures rules and need to comply
Yes.
with
Can you just give me that reference again for the rule?
CCZR 17 for the land
CCZ
use,
17.
and then, yeah.
And is that the typical approach for default approach for activities not specifically listed? Do they default to permitted subject to standards, or does it differ between zones? And I'm talking generally for activities, not fire stations.
Across the plan as a whole, yes, it
Yeah.
differs between zones. So all the centre zones, the catch-all rule is permitted subject to conditions.
Yes.
In other zones in the plan, the catch-all, sometimes is permitted and sometimes is another status.
Yes, so straight to discretionary or something. Cool.
Yeah, it depends on the zone.
Yeah. And in the centre zones where it's permitted subject to rules and there's standards and not compliance, does it generally go to RDA or DA? In terms of the mechanical,
There's a variety of it based
Right.
on, I guess, what would need to be considered.
Sure, but it would be either RDA or DA presumably.
Yes, so RDA typically, if it would fail standards
Yes.
and can be assessed against those standards,
Yes.
or if there is a very specific policy that would relate to that activity, and then
Yes.
discretionary if
So in
It's not
terms
being
of the
anticipated.
central city zone, one of the key standards obviously is active frontage one. Fire stations presumably would fall foul of that standard and require a consent either as an RDA or DA.
I would imagine that, the building would fail that standard if
Yes.
it's on active frontage.
Yes.
The sort of vehicle crossings you get for a fire station are pretty fundamentally incompatible with that active
Okay.
frontage control.
Yes. I know we're not dealing with the transportation chapter now. But would fire stations be classified as a high trip generator?
Peter is right here and can answer that.
Yeah.
Off the top of my head, I don't think there's a particular activity for them in the table, but there is a catch-all of 200 vehicle trips per day.
Yeah. Right. Thank you.
I make it 10:45, which is about halfway through the morning session. Suggest we have a break for 15 minutes and then come back again at 11. And then at midday, we'll have a stock take with where we're at in the process. You see, can be relatively laborious doing this, but I think it is important that we go through as we are. So yes, we'll adjourn until 11 o'clock. It's 11 o'clock. We'll continue. Thank you, Mr. Davis. I am at paragraph 115. We'll just continue on. In policies, 5.3.6, 1.2.1. Sure, well, speak now.
Paragraph 130, there's a disagreement between yourself and the Woolworths representative that supermarkets don't have a pathway to consent under the policies of the plan. Can you just remind me what the activity status for supermarkets are in that zone?
This point would be for the city centre zone and
Yes.
metropolitan centre zone. The city centre zone, a standalone supermarket would be permitted as a land use without conditions. The building would need.
200?
Sorry?
200, did you say?
No, without condition.
Oh, without condition.
The building would need consent, and that probably brings in the various standards. And then in the metropolitan centre zone, likewise permitted without conditions. The two, I think, in terms of the sorts of things that Woolworths operate, they might also fall within other definitions as well as supermarket, and those would probably include car parking, which is one of the key points, which has a standalone rule.
Yes.
Which in both these zones is permitted subject to design standards. And if it was multiple sort of standalone shops included with it, which is sometimes the format I'm aware they use, that could fall within integrated retail activities.
Yes.
Which would trigger an assessment over 1,000 square metres in Metro Centre and a higher threshold in City Centre, which is,
2,000?
sounds right, I don't know. Yeah, 4,000 in the City
Yeah.
Centre, which is, for context, the only integrated retail activity in Lower Hutt that's larger than that at the moment is Queensgate.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, just on that, in terms of supermarket, on one hand, the plan appears to be relatively supportive in concept, but it comes down to the standards themselves, of which there are many, and they're highly detailed. So basically, a fairly complicated resource consent is going to be required regardless. Would that be fair to say?
No, I don't think I'd agree with that. I think the standards are achievable and it would be pretty routine. to
All of
provide
the
full-
standards when read together?
Sorry? It depends on the location, which is one of the key issues in contention. I think for a site that's on active frontage C or not on the active frontages, it would be entirely doable to achieve those standards as a permitted activity routinely.
Okay.
For active frontage A and B, you would need to have a access from another frontage that's not A or B, and then you would probably not have surface car parking, but underground or structured in some way.
In the
So that's
CCZ, what about, would be the same in the MCZ?
Yes, it primarily depends on the active frontage category, not the zone.
Okay.
So just to finish that, presumably Woolworths were referring more to the car parking standards there as opposed to the activity status per se.
Yeah, that's my understanding of their point. It's that car parking rule that they're concerned.
Thank you.
All right, shall we move on? I'm at 133. Moving down, LCZ P3. MCZ P4. P6. P7. CCZ P8, MCZ P8. Okay.
Mr. Davis, thank you for your reports. I have a question regarding significant developments, if we can turn to your paragraph 163, where you've said it means a development that triggers a rule for which the policy is within the matters of discretion. I'm just wondering how that works if we throw in discretionary and non-complying activities into the mix. Is it intended that those policies apply also? And this goes to Urban Edge's concerns around what is a significant development. So just what is that, I guess, trigger?
I guess two answers. One, I think, is a substance question. I think the policy should apply when it's discretionary and non-complying. That in itself suggests something that warrants a high level of assessment. But yeah, as you raise that point, I think that's not necessarily clear from the wording itself.
Shall I have a think about that and get back to the panel?
Yeah,
Yes,
I'm
pardon?
thinking about what to do about that.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Davis, I just had a question about paragraph 160, where you're talking about the issue of urban design outcomes and the CCZ and the MCZ. I just wasn't, I've read paragraph 160 a couple of times now, and I'm just struggling to understand what you're saying there. Can you just reflect on that and explain what, more lay terms, what you're saying there?
I don't think it's a point of huge substance. It's more saying that the substantive decision needs to be had in the discussion of the standard. If you are going to use permitted activity standards, you need to live with the results of whatever it is that is permitted under them. And so at the policy level, that can't be fixed. That's really a decision for how you write the standards and when you decide you're happy with them.
Okay, and you follow that up with when you assess each of the standards that are subject to submission?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Davis, could we just talk briefly about this suite of policies? I'd signaled before that coherence issue around expressing a policy as a series of outcomes that you're trying to achieve. So that's something that's live for me. And I guess I'm just wondering how council firstly arrived at that structure versus say more of a policy direction approach. So that's my first question. And then my second question, perhaps if we look at CCZ P9 as an example, and obviously there's other analogs in the other zones. Just wondering whether there's also potentially some syntax issues with the way that the outcomes inventories are expressed. So if we look at CCZ P9, for example, subclauses 3 and 7 and 11 appear to use active language, whereas the rest seem to use passive language. So that's something I'd appreciate if you could come back to the panel on to get some greater consistency in the drafting.
Sure. Which clauses were those, sir?
So I'm looking at subclauses 3, 7, and 8, which use respectively active language create, ensure, and ensure, whereas the balance of those outcome statements are expressed as outcome statements. So it's just a request for some consistency for cohesion.
Sure, I can have a look at that.
Thank you. So, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. 169 on that. Oh, I've got a question at 171.
I've got one at 169.
You go first.
Okay. It's a bit repetitive, this type of question, Mr. Davis, but I'll ask it anyway. This is where you're dealing with functional need and operational need as raised by Z Energy, I think, in the commercial zones. And at 169, you answer my first question, and that what's the activity status for service stations and commercial zones, and you said that the default activity is permitted subject to standards. And that's the same in an industrial zone. Is that a common approach amongst all of the 4 commercial zones for the permitted subject to standards, or does the local and neighbourhood ones adopt a different entry level?
Every zone has a catch-all rule that's permitted, but the different zones have different other land use rules.
Yes. And different standards?
For the rules that would, generally the only one relevant to land use activities is the active frontages land use standard, which is the same, it depends on the active frontage control. The other standards that typically come in from the buildings and structures rules do differ between
Okay,
zones.
I'm starting to understand the picture now, yeah. So that would be the key, the active frontage would be the key standard for most of these high traffic generating activities, whether they're supermarkets or service stations or drive-through facilities, etc.
Off the top of my head, service stations and drive-through activities would go straight to discretionary in, I think, all the zones off the top of my head. I can check that.
Okay, that's not quite what you said earlier.
We were talking about supermarkets.
Okay, so there's a difference between drive-through and
Yes.
supermarkets, yes, okay. So the entry for those would be straight to discretionary?
Yes, so for example, in the city centre zone, you would be looking at CCZ R21 drive-through activities discretionary, CCZ R22 service stations discretionary.
Yes. Right, but supermarkets adopt the default activity permitted subject to standards, and then whatever that triggers to.
Yeah, it's a point raised by Laura Skilton in her submission about the ordering of the rules, which
You've recommended for rejection, yes.
yeah, I think were it not for the national planning standards, I would recommend having the catch-alls last, if nothing else, but the national planning standards don't let you do that.
Yeah. Thank you, I'm getting the mechanical picture now. Cheers.
Yeah, I just got a quick one on 171. You talk again about functional and operational need and needing to locate in the commercial centres, and you think, well, apart from service stations, well, there's not too many other things which have a functional or operational need that aren't infrastructure related. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that I don't think service stations have a functional operational need to be in the centre zones. They are provided for in a much more enabling way in the industrial zones. For other types of activities,
Is that what happens in reality?
sorry?
Is that what happens in reality?
Most of the service stations in Lower Hutt have been where they are for quite a long time. The new ones recently that I'm aware of is the Gull on Waione Street, which is an industrial zone.
Yeah.
The Gull, I think it is, in Taita, which is an industrial zone, and the can't remember which brand it is, but there's one on the Esplanade, which would have been, I can check this for you, I think in a residential zone.
Yeah, but you've also got the supermarket model, if they've got enough land, is to have an attached
Yes.
petrol station to them, you know, pack and save
Pack and
fuel.
Save. Pack and Save has an attached fuel station at Jackson Street. I'm not aware of how old that is or whether it was another brand of service station before they took it over, because it's not on site, it's over the road.
So you're talking about drive-through, you talk about drive-through at McDonald's and KFC or whatever. What you're saying is that there's a policy bar for them establishing as a relation, in that they can't necessarily comply with standards. Is that where you're getting to? Is it?
I think the situation is different for drive-throughs and service station, like other
Yeah.
drive-through activities. Drive-through activity is defined in the plan, doesn't include a service station.
Yeah.
For service stations specifically, I think the plan is more enabling in industrial zones. For drive-through activities, those are still commercial. They will probably have walk-up customers as well. And so I don't think the plan as proposed does or should necessarily discourage them from the centre zones, but by their nature, they are going to have, local effects that are potentially quite difficult to manage. It's they're going to be suitable on some sites and not others. That isn't necessarily something you can do at a site-by-site level at plan-making stage. And so they do go straight to discretionary. I don't think that is intended to signal that they shouldn't happen in centres. As with service stations, where again, it may be those effects can be managed. There's not a bar as such. It is just that they are potentially incompatible.
I am conscious of time, but we were informed of a new drive-through fast food in Petone, the western end of Petone, and presumably that had to go through some consent process and so forth. In terms of the PDP provisions that apply, and what we talked about, the possible policy bar for these sorts of things, how is that reconciled? Do you know anything about the details of how your resource consents team actually dealt with that?
I'm not aware of that consent. I haven't talked with the resource consents team about that in a while. The last I was aware that was still being processed. I don't know whether it's been had a decision yet.
Okay. All right, just out of interest.
As some context, the ODP does have a design guide, quite a large design guide in the plan that would have been considered against, which sort of combines design guidance and sort of policy directions around the design of
But the
those sort of vehicle.
PDP must have been a factor, something to be considered in terms of determining the resource consent.
I mean, yes, well, obviously would have had to have had some regard to it, but I'm not familiar with.
All right,
consent.
we
That's not what
won't linger on that. Right, I'm at 174. Again, can I just take you to 174 when you outline CCZ, MCZ, P9 urban design outcomes?
Yep.
And under 7A, you've got an insertion where you put where appropriate.
Yes.
It's a qualifier, and this is a plan-wide issue about qualifiers. So who's going to determine where it is appropriate to retain healthy or mature vegetation? Is that an expectation of the council, or the developer will say, well, we've got this great tree here, but it's in the way of the car park, so it therefore needs to come down? So is the developer's view of whether it's appropriate, or is it the council's view of where it's appropriate?
I mean,
Or is it in the round consideration against the policy framework?
I think it would be a general consideration against the policy framework. I mean, it would be considered in the context of a resource consent, where it's always going to be the applicant proposes what it is they propose and gives what justification they give, and then the council assesses that.
Yeah, so, and who's going to determine, and the council's going to determine whether it's appropriate or not. And this does flow across, I'm expecting, a number of sections of the plan, where you have a qualifier put on a policy outcome, and how you actually define whether something is appropriate or not.
Yes, so that's in response to, I don't remember the name of the submitter off the top of my head, but
Yeah.
they were concerned around situations where there were, for example, existing vegetation that was pest species or dead or dying.
Sure.
And so those were their concerns. I think for this case, it's possible to add language like that to the qualifier that would address their concerns specifically. For the case of qualifiers in general, I don't think there is a need for a plan-wide approach for those types of qualifiers. I think it's going to depend on the issue about what needs to be considered, whether it should be specific or general in terms of what that qualifier is.
So every time we come across a where appropriate or recommendation put in where appropriate, we're going to have to actually go on behind the reasons why there is a potential level of discretion about what appropriate is in each time it is used throughout the plan.
Yeah, and so I think the weight you use on the precise language and whether you give examples or whether you call out particular issues to be weighed up or give some sort of framework for that is going to depend on the particular issues. I know, for example, a lot of people are interested in the definition of reverse sensitivity in this plan. As proposed, that included a 11-step policy test for exactly what should be considered in that. And I've proposed simplifying that considerably in what I've proposed. And then there are points from submitters about, well, how should that language be done? How should that couching be done where it's couched? It may be that for other topics, you do want a big, long, detailed sort of policy test for exactly what you consider in those sort of weighing ups, or you may decide that the issue is not necessarily that predictable at plan-making stage, or it's okay for there to be a large amount of discretion and you can use just a general term like appropriate or suitable or something.
Okay, thank you. We'll have to think a little bit more about that. Right. I am at 180, 181. Four, bottom of page 49. Uh, 195. I'm up to 214. Yeah, just your paragraph 215. And fourth line down, you say, and would in practice likely to preclude, presumably, to a redevelopment of the site. However, there still risks that adverse effects from long-term vacant sites and so forth. Is that a matter that there is potentially a competing policy in play there about demolition or removal of buildings? On one hand, you wanted to have demolition followed by buildings, and then if you do have a demolition, it's what you do with the land if it's not immediately followed by a building.
Yes, I guess the point is that the submitter seeks that service stations specifically be exempted from the rule.
Right.
And considering all the merits of their submission, not necessarily just their particular reasons for it, I am saying that would in itself potentially advance the policy goals of the chapter, which are that service stations are potentially incompatible, and we are encouraging redevelopment of incompatible activities if they are incompatible. But you're still worried about what the effects are of a vacant site long-term, even though you would expect that what eventually replaces it would likely be more compatible.
Right, thank you. I'm going right up to 230. Anything before that? 231. Let's go there.
Just in the context of the minor buildings and structures topic that you start at paragraph 231, I'm actually interested in the way you've dealt with this in your rebuttal.
Sure.
And you've recommended a new definition for minor building and minor structure.
Yes.
And my question is of a mechanical nature. Firstly, one of the limbs of the definition is that it qualifies as a minor building or structure if it has a height no greater than 5 meters.
Yes.
And then if we look at MCZ R5 as an example, the permitted activity conditions require compliance being achieved with MCZ S1, which is height. And the height standard is considerably greater than 5 meters, yeah?
Yes.
So I'm just wondering whether there's a conflict there between the definition and the rule as relates to the need or otherwise for referring to the height standard, given that height's specified in the definition.
Sure. Off the top of my head, I don't think there would be any advantage in removing it. I'd have to think about whether there would be any.
Do we need to have a limit on height expressed in both the definition and in the standard? And if so, what if they're different? That's what's currently in front of us.
Yeah, I mean, this is simply a list of all of the standards that apply to buildings and structures in general.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't, I don't think, a conscious choice drafting that from the council that there would be some conflict between them. I think it is unambiguous how it would work at a nuts and bolts level. You need to comply with both the condition and the standard to fall within that arm of the rule. But
I might not be asking my question clearly. So if we take MCZ R5 as an example, that's limited to new minor buildings and minor structures. That's all it relates to. And it refers to, among other permitted activity conditions, compliance with MCZS1, which is a height limit. And that height limit expressed in MCZS1 is different to the 5-meter height limit that you've embedded in the definition. That's what I'm trying to reconcile. Do we need to have both? Would it be clearer if there was only one?
I think off the top of my head, there's no need to have both given it's built in. The standard refers to the specific height control overlay, and for context, the lowest specific height control overlay that's provided for is 8 metres.
Yes.
So off the top of my head, I don't think so.
Okay, well, if you could reflect on that, that would be helpful. And then also going back to the definition, in addition to subclause C that we were just talking about, at subclause E, the definition requires that the building is screened and not visible from public spaces.
Yep.
I'm just wondering how necessary and achievable that is. Necessary in the sense that we're talking about quite small structures to begin with, and then achievable in terms of, your expectations that they're always obstructed from something else?
Yeah, I mean, this is not the general buildings and structures rule. This is for quite limited circumstances provide a wide range of permitted activities. The overall approach for the zone is that buildings, alterations and additions to buildings and structures are considered in resource consent stage. These are Metro Centre and City Centre are both sort of the key visitor destinations for the city, and the ones where the council has the most interest in getting the highest sort of standard of assessment of urban design of buildings. I don't think it's necessarily unreasonable. Depends on what building or structure you're looking at, but again, the difference is simply going into restricted discretionary consent that would have preclusions, notification preclusions.
Yeah, just while you're reflecting on that, do you think that that's subclause E provides a level of certainty to the plan user as to visibility from public places? Is it, to have certainty for a permitted activity standard, do you think that's achievable?
Yes, I think it's I mean, there's a question of whether it should apply, but in terms of applying, I think it's straightforward to apply, whether it's visible or not. That should be something you can determine when you're drawing up the plans for it.
Do you think it's readily determinable?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a similar rule in the, I don't know if it's in the operative Wellington plan, but it was in the first gen Wellington plan when I worked at Wellington City Council. I enforced that rule for building consents on a regular basis.
Would that include a scenario where you have a new minor building proposed in Petone and it's visible from a street in Korokoro? Would it be
Yes, I think it applies to any public
so
place.
visible from anywhere?
Any public place. Yeah.
And it would also apply to a building which is, you have like a 2-metre alleyway down the side of a building and you're putting a new building out the back. So there will be a point on the street frontage where you will actually be able to see part of that building?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a separate question whether it should, but it's clear to apply that it does.
Okay, I think we should move on. I'm at 5.3.9, rules land use activities.
I've got something at 248.
248. David.
I'm just going off my notes, Mr. Davis, that you may have answered this earlier. The GFA that you refer to in 248, 4,000, also, I just wonder what the equivalent was in the MCZ. Is that what you referred to as the 1,000 earlier?
Yes, that would be 1,000 square metres in the
Yes.
MCZ.
Thank you. That was all.
Okay. 262, 264.
Again, 262, that's in the MCZ. So that's, okay, that's 2,000 square GFA there. No question, no question.
Okay. I'm right down to 274.
I've got something at 270. You say that in responding to the Z Energy request to exclude existing service stations from this rule, you say that there are no existing service stations within active frontage A and B in the CCZ, and therefore the amendment would have no effect. You say earlier in this report that the lifespan of this plan could be between 5 and 10 years, depends what happens in plan stop, and under the new spatial plan regime. Would you agree that that the planning period is approximately 10 years and that there might be the possibility of service stations in the CCZ in the future?
It's, I guess, two questions. For the plan, I think you've got to consider both the option of whether it has quite a short lifespan because of the legislation changing, or but you've still got a duty to consider up to the full 10-year lifetime the RMA requires you to
Yes.
do a review over. For the second part, this policy is about existing service stations, so if there are new service stations in the city centre, then they won't be existing.
Okay. Okay, is the policy solely about existing service stations?
I believe the submitter's concern is about existing service stations.
Okay. But the policy's not limited to that, is it?
We're on the car parking rule.
Yes, a car parking policy. Rule, sorry, R3, 13.
Yes, so they would be, I mean, I think it's much more relevant that service stations in general are a discretionary activity, and so this rule isn't, I guess, hugely important what the details of the conditions are for that.
Okay, I might just follow that up with the submitter tomorrow, or later today, perhaps. No, tomorrow.
I believe they're tomorrow because they're also talking about
Tomorrow,
hazardous
yes.
substances.
Yes, 10 a.m. Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Yeah, I've just got a quick one at 275, where you talk about adequate evidence to support the controls on vehicle crossings. And you talk about frontages in active frontage B areas will usually, and active frontage A areas will always have alternate access. So is there uncertainty about active frontage B, or is there some outliers there?
I haven't checked every active frontage B site to be sure, so that was the use of that language. I have checked every active frontage A site. They all have alternative access or don't have existing crossings. And
So
along the street
active
line.
frontage B?
Sorry?
You've got usually in here, in your report.
Yes.
Well, usually, but you're not 100% sure.
I'm
is
not
it?
aware of any that don't, but I'm not 100% sure on active frontage B.
Okay, right, thank you. Two seven four?
Yep. Yeah, I just have a question around the prohibited activity status for car parking for active street frontage A. So you're referring to, I mean, your examples are Hillary Court and Scott Court. I was just wondering, looking at all the active street frontage A areas, do you still consider prohibited activity status to be the most appropriate status? Thinking about potential significant redevelopments over the life of the plan, just means if something unique comes up, you need a plan change to consider it.
Yes, I think these are extremely limited areas. They're all long-standing places that are closed for street events on a reasonably regular basis. The ones in the city centre are part of the Riverlink strategy to substantially reconfigure those areas, and this will leave open the option for the council of pedestrianising them in future, which it doesn't have specific plans to do, but if it wants to expand the quality of its pedestrian network, that's an option for it, and that's a general goal the council has. Jackson Street, likewise, that's the part of Jackson Street used for regular street fare, for which that street is completely closed off to motor vehicle traffic. And then for the local centre zone, both of those are existing pedestrian malls, and so vehicle crossings is completely incompatible with that. I think it's extremely unlikely that there would be some scenario where there is something that has to locate in those areas specifically. There's something so vital that it must be specifically there, and that it needs a vehicle crossing, and it needs to be on that active frontage and not from the service lane. I think that's pretty fanciful, to be honest.
Okay, should move on. I'm down to general rules 287. And then on to servicing 294.
I've got a question regarding the servicing one. Mr. Davis, I haven't come across this rule before. Does it have any existence in the ODP at all?
No, this rule is specifically introduced because the review found a gap in the ODP.
Yep.
The council has struggled to enforce the noise rules for at night for commercial areas near residential. It has generally found it's impractical to infringe people unless it can actually be there recording the noise at the level of noise at the time it happens. Otherwise, somebody doesn't have the evidence that it was over the decibel limit, even though in practice everyone knows it would certainly have been because of the nature of what was going on.
Yes. Has that come out through your consultation with the consenting team and enforcement team?
Yeah, this has been proactively raised with us by the enforcement team on a number of occasions throughout the preparation of the plan.
So the rule's sort of like a backstop to the noise rule?
Yes, I would imagine that if you trigger a consent for this and you can demonstrate that somehow your servicing would comply with the noise rules, that would be a straightforward consent to get. Yes. But it does depend on the details of what's next door and what is the operation, what is the time, what
Sure.
vehicles to use, is it indoor, outdoor, these things can change. So
Yeah, there's been a variety of submissions in relation to this rule in terms of wanting it deleted or the metrics changed in terms of the distance.
Yep.
Is the term servicing defined?
yes,
It is, okay. And has there been any, in your definitions section of the report, has there been any submissions on that definition?
yes.
Okay, we can come to those later, that's sufficient at this point?
I think that's, off the top of my head, I think that's the industrial report.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so new rule, backstop for noise rules to deal with enforcement problems and a variety of submissions. And your recommendation is that the rule's not onerous and should be retained.
Yes, my recommendation is to keep the substance of it, but it is rewritten as one of the submitters asked for.
Yes. Thank you.
So the nature of complaints that council's been receiving on servicing, it's things like business having rubbish collection in the middle of the night, that sort of thing?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'm right down to new rules sort. Proposed standards. Setbacks adjoining zones.
Again, a question from me, going back to 310, Mr. Davis. With emergency service facilities, you say that they'll fall under the catch-all rules. Do they fall within a term like community facilities, or do they have their own defined term?
Emergency service facilities is a defined term in the plan.
But it's not a defined term in the National Planning Standards, is it?
One moment.
Because I think the term community facilities or community activities is a National Planning Standard definition and may actually encompass emergency service facilities.
We certainly use that definition. Means land and buildings used by members of the community for recreational, sporting, cultural, safety, health, welfare, or worship purposes. Includes provision for any ancillary activity that assists with the operation of the community facility. I mean, in a sense, everybody's a member of the community,
Yes.
but I wouldn't interpret that as covering, things staffed by people who are employed to do that job and
Right.
don't have visitors. Even if it does, the structure of the PDP would mean that it would fall within multiple definitions if multiple
Yes.
definitions apply, so multiple rules would apply. That would only affect the catch-all,
Okay.
which in this case is permitted anyway.
Okay. But the important point is that it doesn't have its own definition.
Emergency service facility is defined,
Oh, it is defined.
and it's quite a long definition, but
Okay.
I don't think it would be particularly surprising what it does.
Yeah, got it. Okay, thank you.
I've got sort of a fairly broad question, and Ms. Moore can chip in as required here. And just looking at the CCZ, because that's the one in front of me, but it does apply. Got CCZ 4, 5, 6, and 7, which all deal with active frontages themselves. They constitute about 2 pages of text, 2 and a bit pages of text, highly detailed, lots of analysis to actually look at an individual design itself to make sure you're not falling foul or of any of these. Was there any consideration about consolidating them all together, reducing the number of factors which needed to be looked at in the standard, or any thought of perhaps relying on a good architect to get a good architectural solution as opposed to building to a particular standard? It's a very open and broad question, but I'd appreciate your response.
Sure, I'll get Miriam to comment in a second, but at a high level, one of the goals that the council is trying to achieve with the PDP is to move away from the large and detailed design guides that are in the operative plan for the city centre and Petone commercial areas, which generally dealt with these sorts of issues by always going to a resource consent, and when that consent was conditioned, there was a big design guide that considered factors like these, provided examples, considerations, and so on. One of the reasons for doing this is to try to provide some more certainty for applicants about what the scale of assessment is and what's considered. It is quite detailed, but the idea is that if you do comply with it, you can then rely on having complied with it, that you have met the urban design outcomes that are being sought through the standard, and you don't need to consider it further. Often people will not comply with it, and then they would go back to that discretionary assessment. So you can do it both ways, but it's providing an option for certainty to say, if you do it this way, then you're safe, you've done the job you need to do. It is quite detailed. A lot of that detail is providing exceptions to what would otherwise be quite stringent rules, and so simplifying it, I think, would make it more restrictive in general.
Well, yeah, I think in the Wellington City situation, things are a lot more, not quite as long in relation to active frontages. Have you done a road test? Now, what I mean by a road test is you look at an individual site which potentially has an active frontage for something which is plausible, ticks a whole lot of boxes, and then run that particular development scenario through this sort of standard to look at the workability of it. And again, Ms. Moore might be able to comment on this as well, because it is important when you have at least 2 pages of standards which are looking at one thing, which is active frontages here, that there is a lot of potential for things to, unforeseen circumstances for an applicant. Has anybody carried out that approach in terms of looking at a feasible development?
We did that with the draft version and didn't redo the exercise before the notified. That was looking at existing consent applications rather than trying to design a hypothetical new development. The issue with that, of course, is that real life consent applications are not designed to meet standards that don't exist yet. And so generally you wouldn't be testing that detail so much. It would either clearly comply or clearly not comply without sort of relying on some of those details. We didn't attempt to design new buildings from scratch under those rules.
No, but you could look at a particular block, for example, and look at something which is broadly aimed at compliance with the active frontage standards. It is often a tool used in plan making to actually look through feasible, not fanciful developments, and obviously relying on existing knowledge of previous resource consents as well.
Yes, and these standards do typically come from existing plan provisions or existing resource consent conditions or elements of the design guides. And then in a lot of cases it is sort of providing exceptions to what would otherwise be a general requirement. Those exceptions are probably the key things that haven't been tested, which is why I give that opinion that I think simplifying it would be largely making it more restrictive, and that it would be removing those exceptions.
I'm probably thinking that we might need a little bit more commentary on this for my sake anyway. I haven't discussed it with my colleagues, but I just find it incredibly detailed, incredibly prescriptive, little room for wriggle room if you don't comply with a spatial or a metric standard, except by going through a resource consent process, and whether that's sufficient at the end of the day.
Yes, I'll hand over to Mary Moore, but I will just make one more point in that you would be, in the city centre zone and metro centre zone, you would be doing this in a context in which you would almost certainly be doing a resource consent anyway.
Yeah.
In which you would be considering the urban design policies anyway. What compliance with the standard would be principally achieving is being able to check off an urban design outcome from the list as having been achieved without further says. Yeah.
It's aligned to a tick box exercise then,
Uh,
when it comes to evaluating a resource consent.
Yes, so that's I guess the fundamental reason for the split of the urban design outcomes into two policies. Some of them are amenable to that tick box approach and some of them aren't.
Okay. There's more, you got some comments on that?
Kia ora. I wasn't involved with the writing of the plan and just have only reviewed the submissions, so I have this sort of background context that Mr. Davis has. In terms of testing it, in my evidence that I supplied to Mr. Davis, I did sort of just test one of the, in terms of the continuous glazing, to have an understanding of how that would play out on the ground and that it was achieving the benefits. Because essentially, I understand this rule is in here to, sort of as Mr. Davis said, the plan has gone for moving away from those having design guides incorporated to the plan, which can be quite prescriptive, but they have, which has meant we're adopting it where it's very important to retain sort of high urban design standards, which is in these active frontage areas. It does have a slightly more, I don't want to say onerous, but it is a more prescriptive approach to how those things are managed because, as I sort of mentioned elsewhere in my evidence, basic standards, sort of bulk and location, don't necessarily lend themselves to good urban design outcomes. So the intent of this, the active frontage overlay, is to just apply more prescriptive rules that will help to get those outcomes in very specific places. But in terms of if they could be simplified or have them tested, I haven't considered that in the scope of what I was doing.
I think a number of us have also worked for developers in the past as well. And there is a tendency from some developers, and depending on how good they are and whether they've got a good architect, to go for a line of least resistance. And whether in an urban design sense, that line of least resistance, getting as many ticks in the tick boxes in terms of these standards, actually produces a better outcome or not. Have you got a view on that? About whether prescription can lead to worse urban design outcomes?
Yes, I mean, I've definitely seen that happen, and often it's kind of handy in a context, for example, of a height in relation to boundary standard has been breached, so that you can apply a bit of a more subjective sort of lens onto what's being proposed and the effects that is going to have. So I would agree that in some cases that can happen, but I do think that these active frontage rules, the way that I read them, are quite helpful in what they're achieving to do at the ground level and creating a pedestrian-friendly urban centre.
I'll leave that now, and I think we'll ponder amongst ourselves. Probably some follow-up questions.
Yeah, just possibly to Mr. Davis, the reference to policy LCZPX, which should be a new policy. Paragraph, this is on page 75. It's the matters of discretion if the standard is breached. The clause 1 talks about the relevant matters in that policy, which is entitled Urban Design Outcomes.
That's just quoting the relief sought by Pandion Limited in
Oh,
their
okay.
submission. I can check exactly what they said, whether they'd said PX themselves.
Yeah.
It's an approach I generally used in quoting, although I would have put square brackets
Yes.
hopefully.
Yeah. Do you happen to know whether they actually had suggested wording for that policy as part of their nominated relief in their submission?
Off the top of my head, I think they were seeking a rewrite of the existing policies, but consolidating them into one.
Right. Right, which would, okay, that one could be PX.
Yeah, that would be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, this submitter's not attending the hearing, I don't think.
They haven't asked me
Pandian.
this year, no.
Okay,
I don't
thanks
know
for
if
that
they've
clarification.
streamed.
Okay, where are we up to? LCZE 7 is where I'm at. Anything before that? Out. CCZS 9, Outlook Space. Then we're into new standard sort. City Centre Zone Precinct.
Yes, Mr. Davis, this paragraph 375 on the bottom of 81, going on to page 82. This is about the overlap between the heritage area and the character transition precinct. I take it from what you're saying that there is some overlap.
With the plan in the state it currently is, there would be overlap because the character transition precinct was designed to butt up perfectly against the heritage areas proposed, which was smaller than the operative one, which is now back.
Yeah, but is that now a moot point with the
Yes, because as it
withdrawals?
happened, we also made a mistake in preparing the plan and did not adjust the character transition precinct. So the withdrawal has now accidentally fixed our mistake. Well, not accidentally, because the mistake was
Yes.
just not adjusting it for the new heritage area.
Magic. Thank you.
And I see you've got an invitation at 376 for the submitter to talk about some of the issues, the relationship between the heritage area and the transition precinct as well.
Yeah, I guess the key there is that for this, given the submitter's reasons for asking for that change, I wouldn't imagine they would be interested in pursuing it. But in principle, there's no scope bar on doing so because it's not a heritage provision. So
Yeah.
they, in theory, would be welcome to come along with completely new reasons for asking for that.
Okay, thank you.
I think they've addressed it in the evidence that they've lodged, which isn't covered in the rebuttal because it arrived quite late. But they'll be going to the hearing anyway.
Right, I'm right down to zone maps. Yeah,
The first one is 308 Whawhetu Road, Mr. Davis, and this is the Urban Plus and Koingora one, and you deal with this later in the report at 446 and 452, where I think that's in relation to the frontage overlays for 308.
Yeah, so kind of it's a victim of the structure of the 42A report
Yes.
and something has to be. But I guess at a high level, they're seeking to rezone that site from the local centre zone to the mixed use zone and then make a lot of changes to the mixed use zone in concern about how those provisions would apply to that site.
Yes.
Which at a high level, I think the easiest way to solve that issue is to leave it in the local centre zone.
Yes.
But they have their own view, which
Sure. Yeah, at 446 and 452, you come to the conclusion, I think, that the frontage overlay can be removed,
yes.
and then you say that the rezoning needs to be dealt with separately, and it's dealt with here at 390, and you're not swayed to change the zoning in any way.
No, and from reading their submission, they haven't asked to appear, but from reading their submission, I think that is their main practical concern with what they're intending to redevelop on this site.
Yes. Is just testing that, the changes that they would require to the MUZ would be zone-wide, wouldn't they? That wouldn't be specific to their site.
In the submission, yes, I think there's scope to do them across the mixed-use zone. It would be up to you whether you thought they were warranted across the zone or whether they should be
Yes.
site-specific or whether they
But
should
you,
be.
you
local
appear to
law.
have a concern with that sort of global approach if it might create some unintended consequences for other sites.
I've assessed them all as though they would apply zone-wide. I
Yes.
haven't looked at them in a site-specific lens because I think, again, the simpler way is to leave it in the local centre zone, which is already close to what they're asking for.
Understood. Thank you.
Just while we're on it, I'm thinking it's midday now, but just, what's the key difference for this particular site in relation to the local centre zone and the mixed-use zone? In terms of what it can do as a mixed-use zone as opposed to what it can do as a local centre zone?
With the active frontage control removed,
Yeah.
the main difference would be in the scale of commercial activity that's allowed. It would provide for on-site visitor car parking for activities. It would have a much larger GFA threshold, which is 500 square metres instead of 100 or 200 for different types of activities.
Oh, it's a matter of scale.
Yeah,
It's not a very big site, though, is it?
Sorry?
The 308 Waifatu Road's not a very big site.
It's reasonably big, so I mean, it would be the largest site by quite a margin in the Waifatu, in the
Yeah.
Fairfield shops.
Okay. All right, I'm tempted to push on a little, okay? Right, where it's active street frontage overlay maps. Anything there? Yeah, I just got 413. So I generally think the application of the active frontage overlays is roughly right. So it's, you're 90% confident that it's pretty good? Or what do you mean by roughly right?
I mean, I think generally the areas that have been singled out for high level of protection are the right types of areas, and the scale of it, what fraction of street frontages across the zones as a whole have those controls is.
So is there much in the, is there much uncertainty or much around the edges, if you like, between sites which could be in and sites which shouldn't be in?
Yeah, I mean,
Is that what you mean by roughly?
Yeah,
The word roughly just came out of me.
I think every you could do a sliding scale across every street frontage in every one of these zones and sort of graduate them. There wouldn't be any sort of sharp distinctions across most of that. It's a question of how far do you go and what level you do. So there's a lot of areas and sites that I think are arguable. I've, again, looked at some specific ones raised by submitters and in general areas where I thought there were, especially at northern end of the city centre, where I think a lot of them were marginal.
Okay.
I think, again, every street is different, every context is different. You can go into a lot of detail with any particular area about where it falls compared to others.
All right. Should we move on? Talking about active frontages, physical locations, all the way down to I'm at 421 at the moment. 439.
Guess I'm just interested in Ms. Moore's view as an urban designer, looking at the example given by Mr. Davis at corner of Featherston and Whitmore Streets, which I think is no longer with us.
No.
But if that's the type of design outcome that's being encouraged by the standards, is that a good design outcome in your view?
I just, which I need to quickly read the elements. I mean, overall, it's not a great design outcome, particularly in a centre zone. But as I've sort of put within my evidence, it's very difficult to sort of make these sites to have good design outcomes, which is why it's good to manage where they are.
I don't think Zed put that in. I think you find the council did it because it's the direct line from the station to the rest of the CBD and got a large area of which is not undercover in Wellington's winds and rain.
I think also Mr. Mike Don was very proud of that structure from a wind perspective. But that raises a wider question. It's more about form and function, and service stations are typically aren't built up to frontages. That's sort of counterproductive to their function. To what extent do you think some of these urban design outcomes are actually going to be able to be achieved with a drive-through facility such as a service station, particularly with this rise of unmanned service stations, where in the past the convenience store might have achieved some sort of form of articulation along the frontage. Now they're essentially set apart from the canopy, if there in fact there is a canopy, the bowsers are generally set back to allow for traffic circulation, and they become largely asphalt thick with some edge screening, if you like, softening. Do you think the form and function argument is one that's difficult to ignore in terms of these urban design outcomes?
Oh, there he goes. Okay. I would agree with your point, and I mean, I talk quite a lot to it in my evidence that it is very difficult, and even to this particular example of it, them transforming into these unmanned stations. Is your question in relation to, just struggling to follow, where it's existing sites that are being changed, or just general having these sites in?
Could be both existing, where the sites perhaps redeveloped from perhaps a non-service station like a car sales to a service station seems to be very prevalent, but also brand new brownfield development sites. I'm just wondering, is the plans setting this sort of activity up to fail in terms of urban design outcomes, not being able to achieve them?
My reading of it is it's encouraging sort of this over time land use change where service stations are located in very specific areas, and we try to avoid to have them in the active frontage overlays, but acknowledging that centres is the place where these activities are going to happen. Yeah, so I think the plan does strike that balance of acknowledging they exist, they play a part in our urban form and function, trying to get them out of those key sort of pedestrian routes, and where there might be a situation where a consent is being lodged, there will be adequate discretion of council to really try and mitigate the effects, I guess. And there is limited success in terms of what planting can do, but who knows how urban form will change in the future. Maybe there's sort of things that can be added to the site that might help increase economic productivity for them, and they might sort of start looking at creative ways to better integrate service stations into existing urban form than just sort of plonking these bare sites. Yeah.
On that basis, Davis, do you believe there is a pathway for drive-through facilities that have frontage to an active frontage?
So assuming this would be a completely new service station on a site that didn't previously have one, I think the situation of a car sales yard is potentially, but in most cases I think that would involve at least one new vehicle crossing. CCZP4 is to avoid activities that are incompatible with the planned purpose, character and amenity of the city centre zone. Likely incompatible activities include vehicle crossings on street frontages subject to the active street frontage A and B. I would think that in general, if you are proposing setting up a completely new service station on active frontage A or B, you would apply for that and you would assess that policy and say, that's not compatible with the policy outcome and decline the consent. Yes.
Didn't have my microphone, as a discretionary activity, yes.
Yeah, I think you consider it maybe more generally if you were reusing existing vehicle crossings and then you'd assess, well, what was there before, how does that compare to what was there before, so.
What's the determining point, the previous activity or the existence of existing vehicle crossings? What's the key determination there?
Well, the existing vehicle crossings and what the use of them is.
Yes.
So you might have two vehicle crossings in exactly the right spots and not change where they are, but
Yeah.
the service station might be putting a lot more traffic through them than
Then that
what
would,
was there before.
wouldn't that then be dealt with through the high traffic generating rule?
Well, this isn't really managing a transport network effect, it's managing an urban
Elect.
design outcome, and so it's assessed in the zone.
Okay, so we won't find any urban design type criteria in the transportation rules.
When you get to the transport chapter, there will be some more general points about the compatibility of different types of land use with different zones at a higher level. I don't know if Peter wants to add anything about that,
Okay.
or if you want.
No, that was just a rhetorical question. Okay, so my original question was, is there a consenting pathway? You're saying that depending on the activity and the number of vehicle crossings, but in light of that policy P4 on the CCZ, seems unlikely from your perspective that consent would be granted.
Yes, and so the example that we were talking about is in the context of how those urban design policies and standards apply when there are adds and alts to existing service stations on active frontage A and B.
That's a different kettle of fish though, isn't it?
Yeah, I think at a policy level though, it should do, they should do absolutely everything that is possible.
Yes.
Even if that is not as good an outcome as the service station not being there or, something else happening. And you should be considering in those where there's a substantial change in the existing use, if it seriously cannot comply with any of these urban design outcomes, then it would be a big change in use. Well, should you decline that consent as well? Because we are trying to encourage those incompatible activities to relocate.
Follow-up question to that, and Ms. Moore might want to respond, is does the policy consider the urban design outcomes associated with, say, a service station or drive-through facility versus a vacant site? Do the criteria allow for that examination and assessment? You might want to reflect on that if you don't know the answer offhand, but that's perhaps a question that will arise at the time of resource consent. And I just wondered whether there's a policy expression to enable that consideration to be undertaken. Why don't you reflect on that and come back to us on the right reply unless you have an immediate response?
We'll reflect on it further, but I think that sort of issue of vacant sites is not really dealt with through the policies with urban design in the title as such, but CCZ P3 about potentially incompatible activities, that includes demolition buildings that results in vacant land as an example of potentially incompatible activity. There's nothing that explicitly weighs up those two against each other, and I don't think...
Should there be?
Sorry?
Should there be?
I don't think so. There's a lot of urban design outcomes that you potentially have to weigh up against each other, and it's not feasible to do all of them.
Okay, thank you.
All right, is there anything more before we get to mixed use zone? I think we'll adjourn for lunch now. We're well behind time, as you probably have worked out, and so we will hear from the submitters, and then once we've heard from the submitters, we'll continue on with mixed use zone and then the industrial zones after that. So, Ms. Moore, are you available tomorrow?
Yes, I'm available tomorrow. There's I have an appointment at 3, which I have to be somewhere for, but,
I think we'll bear that in mind. That
Okay.
We've got a morning of submitters due to finish around midday. And if we start at 1, and
yeah,
we can talk to you about the mixed use zones. Presumably you don't have any, particular input to the industrial zones?
not from memory, unless things applied across it.
Okay.
There
So-
are urban design policies in the industrial zones and submissions on that.
But there
I
is a,
don't think-
there is a commonality between the two though, isn't
There's
there?
a commonality. Off the top of my head, I don't think there are any issues that are unique to the industrial zones that are within Miriam's evidence.
All right, well, we'll bear your constraints in mind.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll adjourn for lunch now and come back at 1 o'clock. So, thank you.